celebrate, as we get together, as we remember, all of those things, right? I just want to say, again, I'm so happy that you're here today because I'm excited about this series that we're going to be starting together. Now, first off, I hope each and every one of you had a happy and blessed Thanksgiving. I do think that anytime that we can take a step back and be grateful for what we have in our lives and the blessings that we have, to be reminded of them, both big and small, it's a great time. And so, as we come out of that, I think it moves really well into where we're going today. So again, our Advent series that we're starting is called Searching. Now, during this time of year, it seems like we're all searching for something. We might not know what it is, but we're searching for something. And we feel this tension in our souls. And now this tension, I wouldn't say is a tension from conflict, but rather it's this anticipation that something is going to happen. And we feel hopeful for what's to come. I mean, we have this anticipation where we feel hopeful for what's to come, but yet, deep down, we still feel a sense of longing. And we want so much for something special to happen during this time of year. Something special to happen, but most times whatever happens is it comes up short. You know, we still think that could have been better. We're still left with a sense of longing. Now, for some of us, this time of year already is incredibly hard. Okay? Maybe there's a place missing from the table. Or maybe this year there's just not much on the table. But whatever circumstances you find yourself in today, I think that if we pay attention, there's a part of our souls that is longing for something deeper. That's what we're going to be taking a look at in this series over the next few weeks. And hopefully we'll see two things. One, we're not alone in this longing that we have. And then two, we'll see what this longing is leading us towards. So to do this, we're going to be working through the book of Matthew. So if you'll join me using either your Pew Bible that's in front of you, or if you brought one from home, or if you have the Unite Church app on your phone, you can take that out and turn to Matthew chapter 24. We'll be starting at verse 36. Matthew 24, verses 36 through 44. But nobody knows when that day or hour will come. Not the heavenly angels, and not the Son. Only the Father knows. As it was in the time of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the human one. In those days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. They didn't know what was happening until the flood came and swept them all away. The coming of the human one will be like that. At that time there will be two men in the field. One will be taken and the other left. Two women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and the other left. Therefore, stay alert. You don't know what day the Lord is coming. But you understand that if the head of the house knew at what time the thief would come, he would keep alert and wouldn't allow the thief to break into his house. Therefore, you also should be prepared, because the human one will come at a time you don't know. And this is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. If I took a survey of everyone in here, I think a lot of us would say that things are, or maybe seem to be more chaotic than what they were 10 to 20 years ago. I mean, there's these things that we used to count on as a sure thing, or places that we look to for stability, and they aren't as stable as they used to be. Take, for example, the church. And when I say church here, I'm talking capital C, universal church. Up until about 50 years ago, the church was one of the most trusted institutions in the United States. But for a variety of reasons, trust in the church began to decline. And as trust in the church declined, people just decided, well, what's the point of even going to a local church anymore? In fact, in a study done by Barna Group in 2016, so this is already 4 years ago, in a study by Barna in 2016, 73% of Americans self-identified as Christians. Well, that sounds pretty good, right? 73%. But when you look at it deeper, only 31% of Americans can be classified as a practicing Christian. Now, practicing is defined as holding faith as a high priority in your life and attending a local church worship service one time a month. Not 3, not 4, one time a month. And what's interesting about this, as we dig even further, is that 75% of Americans said they prayed to God in the last week. So obviously there's some disconnect happening here when 3/4 of Americans say they prayed in that last week when the survey was taken, and 73% of Americans self-identify as a Christian, but only 31% attend church monthly. And on top of that, only 34% of Americans surveyed said they read their Bibles outside of church on their own. Now, there's tons of factors that contribute to this, and we're not going to get into every one of them. Right? There's things like abuses by people in power. There's changing beliefs, or perhaps it's even feeling unwanted or not accepted at a church. But all those could be generalized together, I think, by saying that they lead to a lack of trust. People still believe in God and people still pray, right? 73 and 75% of people still do that. But they're losing trust, losing belief in the institutions and even in Scripture. And it's not just the church that's experiencing this, right? We see it everywhere. Lack of trust in the government is probably at an all-time high. As a society, we don't place the same value on an education that we used to. Because sometimes we flat out dismiss the benefit of learning and knowledge. It seems as though every week now, there's another high-profile scandal by a well-known person. And then there's the media. Right? We've become a country of fake news, and where facts are subjective, especially if we don't like that fact or the source where it came from. And rather than listening and reading and watching to gain information, we just look to outlets that'll confirm our already held opinions. So it sounds like a bleak picture. And after all this, where we find these institutions and these places that we look to for stability, finding themselves all on shaky ground, it doesn't mean that life was fantastic 10, 20, 30, 40, or whenever years ago. It doesn't mean life was perfect or life was great then. It just means that we tend to be a people of the now. We tend to be a people of the now. All generations go through a lot of the same things that we do today. It's just that they were able to do it without social media and 24/7 cable news. For a lot of us, we can look at the state of life today. We can see what's happening in our world and think, there has to be something better. Something that can bring us out of this mess. And we're desperate for it. We're desperate and we're looking for something or someone to follow. Now, our scripture today that we read was written to a people who were also going through a time where they had a lot of these same feelings. Matthew chapter 24 begins with Jesus and his disciples leaving the temple in Jerusalem. Now the disciples, as they were leaving, they commented how impressed they were with the temple and its architecture, this grand temple. And it leads Jesus to telling them that eventually the temple is going to be destroyed. And that leads to a discussion about what's going to happen at the end of the world. Jesus goes on to tell them some things, some signs, and he actually warns them that people will falsely claim to be him. Or they'll say that Jesus is in one place or he's in another. But Jesus says in verse 27 that the arrival of the Son of Man isn't something that you go to see. He comes like swift lightning to you. And that leads us to where we were at in our scripture today in verse 36. To fully understand the impact of what Jesus is saying, to fully understand what it means to his disciples, we have to understand a couple of things. First, we need to know what life was like in ancient Judea at this time, at the time of Jesus. Jesus and his disciples, it says they just left the temple. Well, the temple wasn't just some ordinary place. It wasn't like walking into church today. The temple was the absolute center of Jewish life. Everything in their faith, everything in their whole lives was encompassed around the temple. About going up to the temple on the holy days, going to the temple for sacrifices, going to the temple to worship. This is where they went to interact with God. The temple was the space that God occupied on earth. And the Hebrews, or the ancient Jews, they had a word for this. They called it Shekinah. And it was where the glory of the Lord dwelt. And this Shekinah was at the temple. The space that God occupied on earth. The temple that was so representative of the relationship between God and the Jewish people. So you have to imagine the impact it had on the disciples when Jesus tells them that, hey, that's going to be destroyed. It's going to be no more. And then, of course, the disciples are going to ask some questions to follow up. Right? The disciples are going to want to know, Jesus, when's this going to happen? What does it mean? Does that mean the end is coming? The second thing we have to understand then on top of this is that the Gospel of Matthew wasn't written when Jesus was walking on earth. The Gospel of Matthew was written roughly somewhere around the year 80 AD. So about 45 to 50 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Matthew was also written by a Jew for the Jewish people. Or in other words, you can say that Matthew was written by an insider for insiders. It was written to people who have been raised in this faith, who have waited their whole lives for a Messiah, someone to save them. And these people, they knew the signs that were supposed to come with him. And so when Matthew quotes the Old Testament, or throws in a detail about Jewish life and Jesus living in that Jewish life, they know exactly the implications of what's being said. The people that Matthew was written for, they don't need convincing that there's Yahweh, that there's this Father God. What they need convincing of, and what's being revealed to them in the gospel, is that Jesus was his son, that Jesus is the Messiah. And additionally, Matthew 24 is significant because if you're following the timeline that we've laid out, at the time Matthew was written, what Jesus had foretold about the temple had already taken place. About 10 years before, in 70 AD, the temple and all of Jerusalem was destroyed by Roman armies in response to a Jewish rebellion. So their lives are already in chaos. Their lives are already turned upside down. Matthew is writing to a people who are dejected, who are confused, people who are needing hope, living in chaos. But it's in the passage today, it's in our passage today, that the people who read the Gospel of Matthew can begin to find this hope. You see, Jesus tells us that the exact day and hour, they're only known by the Father. There's relief coming, and he makes that known that there's relief coming, and things will be made right. But we have to be looking. Jesus tells us to be vigilant, to be alert, live righteously, so that you are ready when he returns. Sounds pretty simple, right? However, we find that which is simple to do is often the hardest. That which is simple to do is often the hardest. You see, we're called to be people who are fair and who are just to our neighbors. Compassionate people, merciful people, faithful people, and to walk in relationship with God. But we get caught up in these questions and in these excuses that we can make. These questions of what's fair? Do they deserve mercy? Well, I'll make time for God then, when I get around to it. Or, God, he really understands how important blank is. Or even I need to experience blank, and then I'll come back to God, and then I'll come back to faith. We get so caught up in our own living of our everyday lives, we forget to be looking, waiting to anticipate what's to come. So how does this all tie in, right? Maybe you're sitting there and you're thinking, oh, Jordan, that's great. We know the world's going to end one day and Jesus is coming back. That's awesome. But what does this have to do with Christmas? Right? Advent's about celebrating Christmas. Well, here's my answer to that. Sort of. We love how this time of year is familiar. Right? As Christians, we think of the Christmas story as our start. Like our origin story, our beginning. And we spend so much of December and so much of our time in celebration. Celebrating a Savior being born. Celebrating a love so deep that God took on human flesh that would ultimately lead to the cross. But if we're only celebrating, we're missing out on a very key element of Advent. Advent is a season of waiting and preparing. Waiting and preparing in hope. Waiting and preparing in hope of what's to come. Right? We love when things happen right away. We love when things happen right away, and we don't like to wait for things. We want it now. But there's a reason for the waiting. Right? And it's a pattern that's been followed throughout our history as a people of faith. 600 years before Jesus was born, Isaiah prophesied about a Messiah who was to come. Well, then the people of Judah had to wait. And then some time passes. And then we get to the last book of the Old Testament, the prophet Malachi. And Malachi says that, hold on, God's messenger is coming. And then time passes. God goes silent. The radio is out. There's nothing coming. 400 years pass. 400 years pass of people waiting to hear from God, waiting for the Messiah, waiting for their messenger. Now Isaiah and the other prophets, they told the people of Israel the signs of the one who was to come. But in that time of waiting, people forgot to pay attention. They forgot to be vigilant. And maybe they even started to feel like they were forgotten. It was in their anticipation, in this tension that they had of waiting for what was to come, they started to form their own expectations. Their own expectations of what the Messiah would look like, what he would do, and who he would be. And then just like that, he arrived. And he arrived unexpectedly, without any announcement. No crowds, no excitement, just some shepherds. The lowest of the low. People whose lives were less than the sheep that they were watching. They're the only ones who knew. And it's like Jesus said, the arrival of the Son of Man isn't something that you go to see. He comes like swift lightning to you. This is the person that we're waiting for. We can put ourselves in the shoes of those ancient people who were waiting and longing for this Messiah to come, to save them, to pull them out of this chaos. Because we're waiting too. We're waiting because Jesus is waiting for us to be ready. He's waiting for us to be expectant. A lot of us in here know the Christmas story. And we can tell you what the birth of Christ means. But we have to live as though we truly believe what it means for us today. We're a people waiting for God to return, waiting for Him to come back. We're people who are called to be a colony of heaven in a country of death. And we long to see so many things made right. And we long for Christ to return. So as we prepare to celebrate what it means for the Word to become flesh and dwell among us, we wait in the joyful hope. We have this joyful hope in anticipation of Him coming again, of His return. And this is why Paul writes in Romans 8 that creation groans. Creation groans as we wait for the birth of what's to come, where things will be made right. To tell you the truth, the birth is a lot closer than we think it is. So friends, as we gather throughout this season together, remember that while we celebrate the coming and the arrival of the one who makes things right, we're not done waiting yet. We're still a people waiting. The Son of Man comes to you. Christ was born. Christ died. Christ rose. And Christ will come again. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we know that whatever it is we experience, we know that there's a longing in our soul that can only be satisfied by you. And so, Lord, as we go through this time preparing, this time of waiting, this Advent season, Lord, satisfy our souls. Let you be enough every day. Help us to live justly, to show mercy, to walk humbly with you, Lord, lead us to you. It's in your name we pray.